Hey everyone, so recently I took a look at the Ryzen 3 2200G and found that it was awesome value for $99. I mean, look, an integrated GPU that can run PUBG at reasonable settings, you can't really argue with that, can you? And that's just the tip of the iceberg really. I also ran noted GPU mangler Rise of the Tomb Raider on medium settings at 900p with frame rates mostly north of 30 FPS. I mean, wow! And then there was Titanfall 2, locked 60 there. Nice. Now these are taxing games running very well on $99 hardware. And you know, with cheaper PC kit, it's all about seeing just how much you can extract from those ultra limited resources. But I didn't really look at the more expensive Ryzen 5 2400G, principally because my review sample stopped working. AMD sent another, and yeah, I've got some thoughts on it. So I'm starting to detect a distinct trend with AMD hardware. So yeah, Ryzen 7 1800X and indeed the 1700X. Great products, but the much cheaper 1700? Yeah, that's the one I'd actually buy. You get most of the performance and save a packet. Oh, and well, if I were actually building a gaming rig, I'd go for the Ryzen 5 1600 and save even more money. Vega 64, not a massive fan of that if I'm being completely honest, especially when it's so easy to tweak up the Vega 56 and again get the vast majority of the performance and yes, save a fat pile of cash. Which brings us to the Ryzen 5 2400G. It's good, but once again, well, if I'm building a budget gaming rig, the much cheaper Ryzen 3 2200G has most of the performance for just 58% of the price. Now this time around, the plus and minus points of the two new Ryzen APUs are a little bit more nuanced. Let's remind ourselves of the spec before we go on though. These processors are important because they combine a Ryzen quad-core CPU cluster with Vega graphics. We're looking at the Ryzen 5 2400G here, and it's the fully enabled processor. So you've got a Vega GPU with 11 compute units running at a peak 1240 MHz. So that's about 1.75 teraflops of compute there. The Ryzen CCX is also fully enabled with SMT Active. So yeah, think of that as AMD's equivalent to hyperthreading. 3.6 GHz base clock there, but you'll find that frequencies on all cores fluctuate up to 3.9 GHz. But you'll also notice the price, $170, which is a huge leap over the $99 asked for its stablemate. And that's where I'm having some issues with this product. So, quick look at the system I'm using here. It's the same Gigabyte AB350N Mini ITX board and the same G-Skill FlareX memory. Ultra high-end stuff here with low latency and 3200 MHz speed. However, a lot of the fun with these APUs is overclocking them, principally getting the GPU to 1.5 GHz or higher. Now I could do that with the stock cooler on the 2200G, but it didn't cut the mustard with the 2400G with the chip overheating and games crashing. So I needed something meatier, and I actually ended up using the Wraith Spire cooler from the Ryzen 5 1600. Okay, so let's jump straight in with GPU performance with the Vega 11 stacked up directly against the Vega 8 graphics of the 2200G. I'm running both APUs at stock and overclocked to 1.5 GHz. Far Cry Primal is an interesting scenario here. On stock clocks, the 2400G provides a 23% boost over the 2200G. And check out the red line there. Clearly, once overclocked, it'll still beat out the equivalently clocked Ryzen 3 there, but the differential drops to around 10%. And this is where questions kind of need to be asked. A $99 chip versus a $170 chip. For gaming at least, you'd want the differentials here to be rather more pronounced. Looking at our CRYSIS 3 benchmark, this is an example of what I think is contention for resources between CPU and GPU components. And yeah, performance is kind of poor here. And I'd also like to highlight this. Look at the 2400G stock performance here, represented by the orange line. There's a sudden drop here, and what's happening is a sudden stall in GPU clocks. Overclocking locks frequencies, so it doesn't happen then, but I found that this did occasionally kick in on my 2400G testing, more so on the older sample I had before it stopped working. You can also see here that now we're not CPU bound. That contention issue has cleared up and the performance differentials space out. And you can see that in the moment performance between the 2200G and the 2400G varies from nothing at all to about 6 frames per second. Budget PC gaming is all about price versus performance, and certainly for gaming with integrated graphics, you're not getting much return for your extra $70 here. I just wanted to freeze frame for a moment here on this Rise of the Tomb Raider benchmark. Now, note how the green line here is dipping, signifying a drop in Ryzen 3 2200G's GPU clocks. Again, it's the same graphics stuttering issue that the 2400G occasionally has. And again, the route to ensuring it doesn't happen is to lock GPU clocks. But as we move through the benchmark here, you can see the pattern. It's actually a compute-heavy game, and comparing stock clocks, the 2400G is 14% faster, which drops to just 8.6% when clocks are equalized at the overclocked 1.5 GHz. Okay, so The Witcher 3 then. It's a game where 1080p medium in our Novigrad City bench hammers performance here. And again, stock for stock, we're looking at a pretty big win for the 2400G here, about 22%. But, and yes, you can guess what's coming here. With both processors overclocked to the same frequency, the gap drops to just 8%. Grand Theft Auto 5 next, 1080p, mostly high settings. Now you may have noticed that in all cases, the 2200G overclocked matches or exceeds the stock 2400G. But with the higher frame rates in this bench, you can see 4 distinct tiers of performance. However, the difference between 2200G and 2400G, even at stock settings, is just 11%, dropping to 6% with that equalized 1.5 GHz OC. So, I think the bottom line here is clear. 2200G at $99 offers an overwhelmingly high proportion of the 2400G's performance. And I actually found it easier to overclock, and I didn't need to add any other cooler. The one that was supplied was just fine, whereas I really needed that Wraith Spire cooler to get a nice and stable GPU overclock on the 2400G. And you know what? If I'm paying, $69, $70 more for the chip, I kind of think it would be nice to get a better cooler out of the box, right? I mean, the standard one is absolutely fine for stock clocks, but yeah, when it comes to getting value, I want more. Right, so what I did next was to compare the 2400G to discrete gaming with the NVIDIA GT30. And right off the bat, here in Assassin's Creed Unity, you can see that GPU stutter I was talking about earlier, and it's a lot worse. Now, let's be clear here, it happens randomly and sometimes doesn't happen at all. But when it does, yeah, those drops are not good. Again, the overclocks on both chips sort out the issue, and yes, the 2400G OC does actually pull ahead of the GT1030 here. The results are obviously really low on this title generally, but even the 2200G OC does a good job here in offering similar levels of performance to the GT1030. The CRYSIS benchmark kicks off with a huge advantage for the NVIDIA card. Now generally this title is faster on the discrete GPU, but the beginning of the benchmark shows what happens when there is no CPU versus GPU contention. A CPU heavy task, in this case background streaming, can be achieved without having to compete for memory bandwidth resources with the GPU. Now, actually being CPU bound when the GPU is the primary bottleneck in gaming isn't going to happen often on this level of hardware, but you see the difference is there when it is. Returning to the good news though, Far Cry Primal's test run sees both overclocked 2200G and 2400G pull ahead of the GT1030, and even the stock Ryzen 5 performance here draws level. So pretty good stuff there, right? The takeaway is really self-evident though. The comparisons with GT1030 are interesting but hardly revelatory. There are distinct advantages with having a separate GPU, but the APUs still do really well here. The issue really is that with the 2400G's price premium, the value proposition in general is questionable. The 2200G, the cheaper model, is just, well, perhaps too cheap. What I find interesting is that with the overclock in place, there's actually a big difference in compute power. 1.73 teraflops on the 2200G versus 2.1 on the 2400G. Now this is a 22.2% compute advantage to the more expensive chip. But that drops to 10% or under in terms of actual GPU throughput. The CPU side of things though, that's more interesting. Yes, you get a mild clock boost, but it's really the implementation of SMT 8 threads, well, that's the game changer, and you can see that here as we compare Cinebench scores, where I've also included Intel's Core i3-8100. The 2400G matches Intel's single-core performance and flashes it by 37% on multi-core. The 2200G, though, is weaker than the Intel chip, but overclocking to 3.9 GHz will likely close the gap. The combination of extra clocks and SMT gives the 2400G a big CPU boost over its cheaper alternative, about 44% in multi-core tasks. And yes, this translates into improved discrete GPU gaming performance. So as usual, we're testing graphics card performance with an overclocked Titan X Pascal running at 1080p resolution on ultra settings or equivalent. The highest quality simulation then, the most raw cores, but we're still mostly CPU bound in order to separate out the pack. Our CRYSIS 3 test typically favors many core AMD chips, but what's happening here is that SMT is basically allowing the Ryzen 5 2400G to just inch ahead of the Intel competitor in heavy scenes. Ryzen 3? Yeah, I don't think it's the lower clocks that are the issue for the lower performance here, so much as the lack of SMT. The end result sees the i3 inch ahead of the 2400G in terms of average frame rate, but AMD provides a more stable run overall. However, the 2200G is leagues behind, about 24% overall. The Witcher 3 benchmark hits memory bandwidth and CPU power hard, so there's lots of stutter here, most pronounced on the lower performing 2200G. But Intel clearly has the edge here with a 13% advantage, rising to 21% against the 2200G. So you get the idea really, the 2200G is the runt of the litter here, and the 2400G compares fairly well overall, with some exceptions against the i3. But here's the thing, that i3 is around $50 cheaper than the 2400G. Yes, its integrated graphics are an abomination on modern games, but it's also a fair bit cheaper, and this is running on much cheaper memory as well. Okay, so let's wrap this up then. Right, so here's the thing with the Ryzen 3 2200G. I love it because there's nothing like it in its price bracket, and it easily overclocks. In fact, the 2200G is so good that it does a good job of eating up most of the more expensive models' leading graphics, and you don't need any extra hardware to do so. That instantly makes the 2400G somewhat less appealing. Now, CPU-wise, the Ryzen 5 is a lot faster, but in gaming with a separate GPU, Intel can compete well against it. If you need a mix of decent integrated graphics and good CPU performance, the 2400G is pretty good, but there's no knockout blow here as there is with the 2200G. I think it needs to drop in price to $150, and I also think there's space in the market for a 2300G that slots in between the two APUs at $125. Vega 8 graphics and SMT is one combo we don't have right now, and I think that would be the killer APU. But that's where I'm going to leave things for now. As always, please do like and subscribe to support what we do here at Digital Foundry, and join our Patreon for instant access to pristine quality downloads, and of course to support everything we do. But that's all from me for now. Thanks for watching.